Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another sleepy tale from our Sleepless Stories collection. Tonight's story is a gentle journey back through time to a world of candlelit corridors, warm feather beds, and a few overly ambitious medieval mosquitoes. Whether you're winding down from a long day or simply looking to escape into a dreamier world, this story is designed to help you relax, let go, and drift gently into a peaceful sleep. If you enjoy these stories and would like more calming tales to help you fall asleep every night, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tap the little bell for bedtime updates, and share this moment of quiet with someone who needs a little rest too. Now snuggle in, take a slow breath, and let's begin. Once, in a sleepy kingdom nestled somewhere between a forgotten forest and a river that didn't always know which way to flow, there stood a castle that had more bedrooms than people, and more windows than anyone could reasonably clean. It was not a grand castle, not the kind from fairy tales, where dragons circled the turrets and brave knights jousted in the courtyard. No, this was a quiet castle, a castle of comfort, of soft quilts and uneven stone floors that stayed pleasantly cool in the summer and suspiciously cold in the winter. The castle was named Elderdown Keep, which sounded far more dramatic than it truly was. Most of the time, Elderdown Keep was a place where very little happened. Days passed like drifting clouds, soft and slow. Evenings came with the scent of baked apples, and nights brought a gentle hush, the kind that wrapped around you like a warm woolen shawl. Living in this castle was a rather peculiar man named Master Willoughby. He was not a king, nor a knight, nor even a steward of any noble house. He was the royal bed-tester, a position no one had heard of before, and likely one that he had invented himself. But it was on the official scroll, inked in deep green, sealed with wax, and stamped with the emblem of a goose in a nightcap, so nobody questioned it. Master Willoughby took his job very seriously. Every evening, precisely an hour before sundown, he would shuffle through the corridors of Elderdown Keep in his velvet slippers and lavender robes, visiting each of the dozens of bedrooms. He would plump pillows, smooth quilts, and inspect mattresses for suspicious lumps. He even carried a feather scale to weigh the softness of the duvets, muttering to himself numbers that no one understood and nobody dared question. But there was one problem that even Master Willoughby could not solve. The castle, despite its many luxuries and comforting silence, had a mosquito problem. Not just any mosquitoes. These were medieval mosquitoes, long-lost descendants of those who once feasted upon the ankles of kings and queens during banquets and royal dances. They were large, melodramatic, and unusually fond of sneaking into the coziest rooms of the castle to hum operas in your ear just as you were drifting off. No matter how tightly the windows were closed, or how many sprigs of dried lavender and rosemary were hung above the beds, the mosquitoes found a way in. Some said they were ghosts, ancient spirits of tiny warriors determined to carry on their noble lineage. Others believed there was a secret tunnel under the moat that led straight to the linen closet. Master Willoughby, however, had a theory of his own. You see, deep within the oldest wing of the castle, behind a tapestry of a very disappointed-looking unicorn, there was a room that no one had entered in decades. Its door was locked with 3 iron keys, each hidden in a different place, one beneath a loose stone in the courtyard, one buried in the library under the 17th volume of a treatise on wool weaving, and the third sewn into the hem of an old nightgown that had been repurposed as a tablecloth. Willoughby had found all 3 keys over the course of 15 years, mostly by accident. He had no plans to open the door, not until the mosquitoes had begun their midnight concerts, buzzing in complex harmonies and diving at his ears like tiny flying lutes. On the eve of the Summer Snore Festival, a celebration of all things sleepy in the kingdom, Willoughby decided to investigate. The castle was preparing for its annual Snore Off, where villagers competed to see who could fall asleep the fastest and snooze the loudest without being awakened by anything at all. If he could not solve the mosquito mystery, it would surely ruin the festivities. So, with a candle in one hand and the keys jingling in the other, he tiptoed toward the forbidden room. The tapestry fluttered slightly, as if it sensed what was about to happen, and the lock made a sound like a sigh when the first key slipped in. Inside was a chamber covered in dust and cobwebs, but remarkably well preserved. A stone bed frame rested in the center, surrounded by jars of honey and dried herbs. The walls were lined with scrolls, most of them bearing peculiar symbols, mosquito-sized helmets, tiny shields, miniature bunk beds. In the corner, a cage sat open, long empty, with a tag that read, "*, do not feed after midnight." There was also, to Willoughby's astonishment, a diary. He wiped off the dust, careful not to smudge the ancient ink, and began to read. The diary belonged to Lady Thistlewhip, a 13th-century noblewoman with a keen interest in comfort and a fierce hatred of nighttime interruptions. Her entries described her plan to breed a new kind of mosquito, one that would hum lullabies instead of wine, and drink only herbal tea instead of blood. She called them soothskeeters. But something had gone wrong. The final entry, written in increasingly wobbly script, warned that the soothskeeters had become too clever and had formed their own bedtime society. They demanded soft music, warm rooms, and a selection of cheeses before bed. If their needs were not met, they became unruly, buzzing through halls and causing dreams to turn slightly weird. Willoughby blinked. He had not expected this, but it explained everything. With a renewed sense of purpose, he devised a plan. If the soothskeeters wanted hospitality, hospitality they would have. That night, he transformed one of the unused guest rooms into what he called the Mosquito Lounge. He furnished it with tiny hammocks made from handkerchiefs, a gramophone that played quiet flute music, and a platter of aged brie and crackers. It worked. The mosquitoes, charmed by the unexpected generosity, gathered in the lounge and remained there, sipping tea, humming lullabies, and writing tiny reviews in the guest book. The castle returned to its sleepy rhythm, and Elderdown Keep became even quieter than before. Willoughby slept undisturbed, finally able to test beds without the threat of being serenaded by a flying insect. But as he dozed off that night, a new question drifted through his mind. If medieval mosquitoes could form a society, what else in this old castle had its own strange little world just waiting to be discovered? And with that thought, the story continues ... Now that Elderdown Keep had become blissfully quiet once again, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the stone walls and rested in the folds of the curtains, Master Willoughby found himself with a curious abundance of time. With the soothskeeters peacefully tucked into their miniature hammocks and the Mosquito Lounge now officially registered in the castle scrolls as a diplomatic sleep zone, Willoughby resumed his duties with extra care and an odd sense of curiosity blooming like chamomile tea. You see, in all his years of testing mattresses, inspecting pillowcases, and noting the optimal temperature for woolen blankets, he had never truly questioned the rest of the castle. The chairs, the rugs, the coat hooks, shaped like squirrels. He'd seen them every day, but now he wondered, what were they up to when no one was looking? He began with the slippers. Slippers in Elderdown Keep were not ordinary things. They were handmade by the royal sockmaster, a person who had once designed sleeping socks for a duke who hadn't walked in 20 years, but still insisted on fashion. The slippers had small velvet bows, linings softer than sheep's size, and tiny bells that jingled so quietly they sounded like polite whispers. But these slippers had a secret. Every evening, just after the bells of dusk tolled from the old tower, the bell ringer was a goat named Hark, who did it out of habit, having once chewed through the rope and gotten stuck there. Something very peculiar happened. The slippers came alive, not all at once, not with great drama or magical lightning. They simply shifted, a gentle tap here, a little wiggle there, a stretch, a shuffle, a twist. as if they were settling in for the night. One pair, in particular, seemed to have a destination in mind. They belonged to Lady Thistlewhip, or had, long ago, and had been left in a cupboard near the second-floor linen room. They were pale rose in color, with faded embroidery of stars and teacups stitched across the toes. Willoughby had come across them while doing a routine blanket fluff, and found the slippers neatly positioned beside a drawer labeled mittens, left hand only. He set the slippers near a cozy little fireplace, hoping they might enjoy the warmth. Then he watched, not because he expected anything, but because the castle had become just quiet enough for his mind to wander into curious places. And that's when it happened. One slipper lifted slightly, gave itself a dignified shake, and nudged the other. They turned slowly, as though remembering an old dance, and began to shuffle across the rug. Not quickly, not loudly, just two slippers, making their way down the corridor. Willoughby, slippers in hand, or rather, slippers in sight, followed. They led him through a hallway he'd passed hundreds of times, but never really seen. The windows were stained with images of nap-time saints, all dozing peacefully on clouds or leaning against haystacks, with blissful snores etched in colorful glass. At the end of the hallway, the slippers stopped in front of a door that looked like any other, except for a single difference. It had no knob, only a small round hole about the size of a cat's nose. Willoughby knelt and peered inside. Darkness, but not the scary kind, the warm kind, like the space under your blanket, where it's still cool and quiet, where dreams begin to take shape like fog on a meadow. The slippers waited. With a curious shrug, Willoughby reached into his robe pocket and pulled out a candlestick. It was shaped like a goose, his favorite, and had a wick that always lit on the third try, never the second. He struck a match. The room beyond the door was not empty. It was a slipper library. Dozens, no, hundreds of slippers lined the walls, perched neatly on shelves, sorted by color, fluffiness, and preferred bedtime beverage. A sign hanging above the nearest shelf read, ****, Slipper Society, respect the quiet." ***, Willoughby's jaw dropped gently. Not dramatically, just a small, respectful drop. The air in the room smelled of linen, lavender, and a hint of peppermint foot balm. At the center of the room, an old armchair sat facing a hearth where ghostly slippers swayed like paper lanterns. He didn't move, not right away. He watched as the slippers he'd followed took their place beside a pair that looked like they belonged to a retired tap dancer sequin. Elegant, slightly smug. No one had ever spoken of this room. Not in bedtime tailies or castle gossip. Not even in the footnotes of the sleep log scrolls. He backed out slowly, closed the door without a sound, and returned to his room with the same quiet energy as the castle itself. That night, as he lay in bed beneath a blanket stitched with moons and yawnberries, he reflected on what he'd seen. Not every mystery needed solving, he decided. Some were simply meant to be discovered, respected, and left in peace. But the next morning, curiosity returned like a gentle knock at the back of his mind. If the slippers had a secret society, what about the pillows? So the next day, after a light breakfast of oatcakes and honeyed tea, taken with the morning sun streaming in through a round window that made everything look slightly more golden than it actually was, Willoughby began his next quiet investigation. He started with the pillows in the blue room. The blue room was so named not because of its color or its curtains, but because the original owner had once tripped over a chamber pot and shouted a series of unprintable words before collapsing on the bed. From that day forward, the room had simply been known as Blue. The pillows there were particularly plump, with stitched initials WT, which no one remembered the meaning of. Willoughby fluffed one, gave it a polite tap, and turned his back. He waited. Nothing. Then he fluffed another. Still nothing. But when he bent down to straighten the bed skirt, he heard it. A sigh. A tiny, delicate sigh. The kind of sigh a leaf might make if it had feelings and spent a long day stuck in a book. He turned. The pillow remained perfectly still. But then it happened again. This time, a different sound. Not a sigh, exactly. More of a whispery, Willoughby frowned. Or rather, he smiled in a way that looked a little like a frown, because this situation was both delightful and puzzling. He fetched a stethoscope. Not an ordinary one, but a snoroscope, a device invented long ago by the Sleepwrights Guild to measure the echo of dreams through layers of fabric. He pressed it gently to the pillow. Voices. Faint, cozy, cushiony voices. Did you hear about Featherpile's new stuffing? Goose, darling. Actual goose. Oh, please, down is so last century. I'm filled with cloudberries now. Sustainably sourced. Willoughby almost laughed. Almost. But he didn't want to interrupt. Instead, he scribbled notes in a little book titled Asterisk. Things I shouldn't know, but now do. He didn't try to talk to the pillows. He wasn't sure how to begin. Instead, he simply added a new tag to their cases. Asterisk, asterisk. Do not disturb dreaming in progress. Asterisk, asterisk. By the end of the week, he had discovered at least 7 more oddities. The curtains in the West Tower rearranged themselves nightly to create the perfect moonlight diffusion pattern. The rugs took naps at precisely 2 p.m., becoming unusually warm and soft. The grandfather clock in the hall skipped every 7th tick to give dreamers a moment of extra rest. The teacups whispered compliments to anyone who held them gently. The paintings of sheep on the wall changed positions when no one was watching. The fireplaces occasionally emitted sighs of contentment, particularly after hearing a good lullaby. And the books in the East Library fluffed their pages just before bedtime, like animals settling into nests. Elderdown Keep, it turned out, was not just a sleepy place. It was a living, breathing lullaby. And Master Willoughby, in his robe and slippers, was its gentle caretaker, not of royal decrees or battles or ballads, but of comfort, of softness, and of mysteries best left slightly unexplained. And as the stars spun lazily above the castle, somewhere far away from the maps of modern minds, the walls of Elderdown hummed with the unspoken promise of one more restful night. There was a room in Elderdown Keep that no one used. It wasn't because it was cursed or haunted or filled with forgotten laundry, though it had, at one time, been mistaken for a linen storage chamber due to its rather large collection of folded quilts and the faint scent of lavender in the air. No, the room was simply ... forgotten. It had no name on the floor plans, no notes in the castle ledgers, no scheduled visits from the Royal Dusting Committee, which consisted of a sleepy tortoise named Binley and a feather duster tied to a stick. It was a quiet little room at the end of a hallway that curved so gently no one realized it was curving at all until they'd gone in a circle. Master Willoughby discovered it one evening by accident, though he would later say it was less of an accident and more of a quiet invitation. He had been inspecting the mattresses in the East Wing, counting their springs and measuring their dream depth, a rather peculiar system he had devised involving yawn length, pillow pressure, and ambient slipper warmth, when he felt a strange pull toward the curved hallway. It was the kind of feeling you get when you suddenly remember a word you'd forgotten, or when you open a book to the exact page you need. At the end of the hallway, he found a wooden door with no handle, just a gentle push space shaped like a thumbprint. He pressed it. The door opened without a sound. The room was dimly lit by a window, so round and clean, it looked like a drop of morning dew suspended in air. Dust floated slowly, like sleepy snow, and all around the room were quilts. Quilts of every size and stitch, folded neatly or hung like banners from the beams above. Some were patterned with stars and clouds, others with winding vines and tiny stitched animals. One had a map of the night sky embroidered in silver thread, complete with tiny constellations that shimmered just slightly, as if remembering real stars they had once known. Willoughby stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Immediately, he felt its soft warmth, like the hug of an old friend or the quiet joy of slipping your feet into warm socks on a cold morning. He moved slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever peace lived here. A quilt fluttered gently as he passed, as if nodding to him. Another puffed slightly at its edges, like a sigh. He approached the center of the room, where a single quilt lay across a fainting couch covered in worn velvet. This quilt was pale gray with streaks of soft blue, the color of early dawn, and embroidered with tiny shapes, some geometric, some swirled, others almost like handwriting. And on the very edge, barely visible, a name. The Remembering Quilt. Willoughby ran his fingers gently over the stitches. The moment he did, something curious happened. His thoughts slowed, his breathing deepened, and his memories ... shifted. He was no longer standing in the quiet room. He was small again, curled beneath a heavy quilt in the castle nursery, listening to the creaks of the old ceiling beams and the soft snores of the nanny goat who used to keep watch by the fireplace. He could smell apple biscuits and warm milk. He could hear the sleepy melody of the lullaby the housekeeper used to hum, something about dandelions and daydreams, and a goose who lost its slippers. It was all so vivid, like opening a book he didn't know he'd kept in his mind. When he opened his eyes, he was still in the room. The quilt had not moved, but the air around it shimmered faintly, like the space just before a dream. He sat for a while. Then he reached for a corner of the quilt and folded it gently into his lap. For the rest of the evening, he did nothing. Just sat, breathed, and remembered things he hadn't thought about in decades. Little things like the way the candlelight used to flicker against the blue tiles in the washroom, or the tiny carved owl hidden in the bedpost of the guest suite. The quilt didn't speak, but it held something, a kind of quiet knowing. He returned the next night, and the next. He didn't tell anyone, not even the pillow club or the slippers. It felt too private, too special. He didn't bring books or tea or any of the scrolls he usually carried. Just himself and the calm that seemed to settle over him the moment he stepped through the door. Sometimes the quilt showed him memories he didn't quite remember, but knew were his like shadows of forgotten thoughts made warm again. He saw the day he first arrived at Elderdown Keep, clutching a suitcase with only 3 socks, a tiny pillow, and a letter of recommendation from someone who may or may not have been a distant uncle. He had been nervous then, unsure if there was a place for a man whose talents included rating the fluffiness of cushions and organizing teacups by emotional warmth. But he had found one, and in this room he remembered why he had stayed. It was not just the soft beds or the friendly ghosts, or the way the fireplaces never judged your choice of sleepwear. It was the quiet, the kindness of it, the feeling of being held gently by something older than memory. One night, as he sat tracing the stitches in the remembering quilt, he noticed something new. A thread, glowing faintly at the corner, slowly weaving itself into the fabric. He leaned in. It was ... him. A small, quilted figure in a lavender robe and velvet slippers, holding a feather in one hand and smiling softly. The quilt, he realized, remembered him too, not just his memories. Him, all the little pieces that made up who he was, his careful footsteps, his muttered observations, his fondness for hot tea and cold toes. He wasn't just visiting the quilt. He was becoming part of it. In a way, everyone did. Each guest who had ever stayed in Elderdown Keep, each child who had fallen asleep in its halls, each song hummed to the flickering light of a fireplace. Each moment had found its way into the quilt. It wasn't magic, or maybe it was, but not the kind with sparks and spells. This was a quieter kind of enchantment, the kind made of time and softness. One evening, he left a note beside the quilt, written in his softest ink. It read, "If you ever need to remember something kind, or feel the warmth of a day long past, lie down here. The quilt remembers, and it's always gentle. He folded the note into a heart and tucked it under a stitch shaped like a tea kettle. From then on, the room was no longer forgotten. It was known simply as the quilt room, and though it had no official designation in the scrolls or maps, those who needed it always seemed to find their way. And the quilt kept remembering, softly, slowly, without judgment. Because sometimes the oddest things are the most comforting, and sometimes what helps you sleep best of all ... is being remembered. It began with steam, not the ordinary kind that floats up from a cup of hot tea in slow, swirly wisps. This steam curled in loops, then in spirals, then into a shape that looked remarkably like a tiny duck in flight. Master Willoughby had just finished pouring himself a cup of nettle rose tea, his usual evening brew, when he paused to watch the steam form that curious little creature in the air. It fluttered once, twice, and then vanished as quickly as it had come. He blinked. Then he sipped, and frowned, not because the tea was bad, but because the moment the steam duck disappeared, a light tap, tap, tap sounded against the tall windows behind him. Rain. He stood, slowly, and crossed to the glass. Sure enough, tiny droplets began to gather on the panes, tiptoeing down like dancers, just beginning a slow rehearsal. The evening had been clear moments ago. Moonlight tucked softly in the sky, stars blinking in their gentle rhythm. Now, clouds. He returned to the table, eyes falling again on the teacup. It was one of the older cups in the castle, part of a mismatched set that lived in the third cupboard beside the pantry door. Most of the cups in that cabinet had personality. One was chipped like a storyteller's tooth. Another had a handle that sang very softly when stirred too quickly. But this one had a tiny crack in the shape of a raindrop and a faint pattern around its rim clouds. Willoughby now noticed. He turned the cup in his hands and found a barely visible inscription near the base, written in the kind of cursive that looked half scribbled and half danced. Asterisk, asterisk, cup of weather, sip with care. Asterisk, asterisk, he set it down gently. The next morning, he returned to the cupboard and chose the same cup. This time, he filled it with chamomile and honey. The steam rose slow and steady. And then, yes, there it was. Not a duck, but a swirl that turned into what could only be described as a tiny gust of wind. The steam whipped around itself, puffed outward, and then disappeared. By noon, a gentle breeze had begun weaving its way through the castle corridors, rustling tapestries and stirring pages of the castle guestbook. By that afternoon, Willoughby had collected all the teacups from the third cupboard, laid them out on a long linen-covered table, and labeled them carefully. Observations of steam shapes and corresponding weather patterns he wrote at the top of his scroll. He tested each cup, one at a time. The cup with a gold rim and ivy leaves produced a long steam swirl that ended in a loop. Later that evening, fog rolled over the garden, thick enough to make the statues look like they were dreaming. Another cup, a squat one with no handle, but a painted sun on the base, released no steam at all, but immediately fogged his glasses. The next morning, the sun blazed through the windows, unusually strong for late autumn, and made everyone in the castle rather sleepy. And one very strange cup with blue stripes and a missing chip-released steam in the shape of a fish. Willoughby had barely documented it before the castle was struck with a soft but steady downpour that smelled faintly of sea salt, and a flock of herons flew over the towers, squawking as if they were very late for something. By the end of the week, Willoughby had assembled what he called his tea forecasting kit. 12 cups arranged by tendency and temperament, and a pocket-sized chart that read like a weather map for moods. Cloud-shaped steam meant rain within the hour. Wavy steam indicated wind, especially through the library vents. Twinkly upward curls predicted a starry night. No steam at all suggested the blankets would feel heavier that evening. And if the steam formed a shape no one could quite identify, that meant dreams would be especially odd, usually in a good way. He shared his findings with the castle staff, but only Binley the tortoise seemed interested, and even then, only when the tea smelled like hibiscus. The rest of the keep treated it like another of Willoughby's gentle oddities, useful if one remembered, amusing if one didn't. But word spread. Visitors began requesting their forecast in tea form. "Will it snow tonight, do you think?" Someone would ask, and Willoughby would quietly fetch a mint and rose blend in the spiral cup, wait for the steam to curl in delicate rings, then nod solemnly. "Expect frost on the pillows," he would say, and he was nearly always right. One evening, just before the great blanket refluffing ceremony, Willoughby received a letter. It had no return address, only a wax seal with the shape of a steam swirl pressed into it. He opened it carefully. Inside, a single sentence in handwriting that shimmered slightly. "Greater than the sky listens too. Thank you for noticing." There was no signature, no explanation, but Willoughby folded the note and placed it inside the cup of rain, where it stayed from that day forward. The next morning, the clouds over Elderdown parted for exactly 7 minutes and 33 seconds, long enough for the sun to slip in and warm the stone floors like a quiet smile. From then on, weather in Elderdown was not predicted by calendars, or barometers, or mysterious goats chewing on pine cones. It was predicted by tea. And so, each morning, before his rounds began and after his slippers had done their ceremonial warming jig, Willoughby would choose a cup, pour a thoughtful blend of herbs, and watch the steam. And somewhere in the castle, perhaps near a chimney, perhaps behind a curtain, perhaps in a corner where forgotten dreams waited patiently, something would shift, not loudly, just enough for the weather to know someone had noticed, and just enough for the rest of the castle to prepare its many oddities accordingly. Because when you live in a place where slippers dance and quilts remember, and steam whispers secrets into the air, the weather is not simply outside, it's part of the dream. The castle of Elderdown Keep, with its sleepy towers and kindly quirks, had many rooms that shifted gently through time, each holding its own peculiar softness. Some rooms whispered dreams, others brewed weather in their teacups, and at least one was home to a library for slippers. But nestled beneath the west wing, far beyond the pantry, and behind a wall that hummed faintly in the evenings, was a hall few remembered. It was not a ballroom or a dining chamber, or even a place where people gathered to discuss tapestry maintenance, though all of those existed in abundance above. No, this hall had a different purpose altogether. It was known by those who still spoke of it as the grand hall of almost forgotten sounds. Master Willoughby had never intended to find it. He had been searching for the royal darning needle, a thin and fussy object that tended to hide under rugs and within pockets that hadn't been worn in years. The needle was required to repair the ceremonial snore banner, which had frayed slightly during a particularly enthusiastic nap festival the week before. With a candle in one hand and a spool of sleep thread in the other, Willoughby wandered through a narrow corridor behind the dining room, a place where pots went to echo and brooms often whispered gossip when no one was sweeping. He turned a corner he didn't remember turning, and there it was, a wooden archway framed by polished stones that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. Carved into the top of the arch were words, so faded and curling with time that he almost missed them. Asterisk, asterisk, here live the sounds that stay when no one listens. Asterisk, asterisk, he stepped through. The hall beyond was vast, yet gentle. Its ceiling arched like a stretching cat, and the walls were paneled in a warm wood that absorbed every step, muffling his movements until it felt like walking through a memory. He heard it first, not loudly, just the soft, tinny pluck of a music box that hadn't been opened in decades. Then a whisper the sort you hear just before waking, when a dream leaves its last thought behind. Then more sounds, layered gently on top of one another, a page turning slowly in a forgotten book, the creak of a rocking chair abandoned mid-rock, a bell chime from a tiny shop long gone, the distant clink of spoons and cups from breakfast tables that no longer existed, and the hum, oh, the hum, the steady, patient sound of someone thinking deeply beside a window in the rain Willoughby froze, candlelight flickering slightly as he breathed in. The room was not empty. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books, but with glass jars of all shapes and sizes. Inside each one was a swirl of air, some faintly glowing, others fogged with age. Labels were tied with fraying ribbon. He read them slowly. Grandfather's last whistle, the dog's paws on the kitchen floor, first snore after a long journey, teacup lid tapping in nervous hands, midnight blanket shuffle, a yawn shared between two strangers. Willoughby didn't touch them. Not yet. He walked slowly, letting the sounds wash over him, recognizing some and wondering about others. Near the back of the hall, a round table stood, covered in felt the color of cloudy tea. In the center, a bowl sat filled with what looked like tiny seashells. Each one vibrated softly, giving off an almost imperceptible hum. Beside the bowl, a note in careful script, asterisk, asterisk, place one to your ear and listen, but only if you are prepared to feel something you'd nearly forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk, he hesitated. Then he chose a shell the size of a thimble, slightly chipped at the edge, and brought it to his ear. A breath. Then a laugh. Small, high, unfiltered. The kind of laugh a child makes when discovering something entirely pointless and wonderful, like a beetle on its back, legs waving, or a curtain that turns you into a ghost if you stand beneath it just right. And then his voice. His own voice, long ago, answering the laugh with one of his own. He remembered the day now. He had been 6. His slippers had gotten stuck in a floorboard. He had fallen. His sister had laughed. He had laughed. The floorboard had laughed too. Or maybe that part was invented later. But the moment was real. He placed the shell gently back in the bowl and sat down in the chair beside the table, not because he was tired, but because his heart had become warm in a way that made standing feel unnecessary. He sat there a long time. The jars continued their soft chorus. Not all the sounds were happy. Some were the soft ache of goodbye, the silence after someone left, the rustle of a letter never sent. But even those were kind because they were remembered. And here, in this hall beneath the castle, remembered things were not left to vanish. They were preserved softly, without judgment, kept company by other forgotten echoes, humming gently into the stillness. That night, Willoughby returned to his room and wrote a new entry in his leather-bound sleep journal, the one he only used for very rare thoughts. He wrote, "Greater than, there are sounds you carry, even when you forget you're carrying them. They are small, patient, and kind. Tonight I remembered how quiet isn't emptiness. It's simply making space for what's still singing." After that night, he visited the grand hall often, never too long, never too often, just enough. He began bringing others, gently, one at a time. A nervous page who missed her mother's voice. An elderly butler who'd forgotten the sound of his own name being said with affection. A baker who once heard the perfect ding of a cake timer and never again could replicate it. Each one left lighter. The sounds did not change, but the listeners did. And so the hall continued, quiet and humming, always ready for the next person who needed to remember something not with their minds, but with their ears. And Elderdown Keep, as always, made space. Because in a castle of soft quilts, talking teacups, and slippers with dreams of their own, there would always be room for one more sound, softly placed on a shelf, waiting to be heard again. By now, Master Willoughby had come to understand that Elderdown Keep was not a place where things stayed quite as they were. It was not a castle of strict tradition or stern corridors. Instead, it shifted gently around its own rhythm, one stitched from sighs, snores, tea, and old dreams. Here, even the walls occasionally murmured when the moonlight was just right. It was on one of those moonlight-filled nights, the kind that made shadows stretch a little farther and candle flames waver a little slower, that Willoughby noticed something odd about the tapestries. He had seen them 1,000 times, of course. They lined nearly every hallway of Elderdown Keep, long strips of hand-woven storytelling that were said to have been stitched by a convent of dozing nuns hundreds of years ago. Each tapestry told of story battles that were never fought, feasts that lasted 3 weeks, and goats who became dukes in very quiet political coups. One tapestry in particular always caught Willoughby's eye. It was near the turn of the South Library corridor, where the floor sloped just enough to make carts roll gently if left unattended. The tapestry showed a fox playing a lute while surrounded by noble badgers holding goblets. It was a charming scene. The fox wore boots. The badgers looked just tipsy enough to be amusing, but not unkind. But on that night, something about the tapestry had changed. The fox wasn't playing the lute anymore. Willoughby stared. He was sure of it. The lute, which had once rested neatly in the fox's arms, was now tucked under the badger on the left. The fox was instead holding a scroll, as if reading aloud. The badgers, though still celebratory, seemed more attentive now. One had even removed his goblet and appeared to be taking notes. Willoughby blinked, rubbed his eyes, and then fetched a stool. He stood and inspected the stitches. Nothing was loose. No repairs, no new threads, no sign of tampering. He returned the next morning, and again that evening. Each time, the scene had shifted just a little more. By the third day, the badgers had formed what looked like a choir, and the fox, now wearing reading glasses, was conducting them with a long twig. Willoughby began keeping notes. ***, Tuesday. Fox returns to lute. Badgers confused but supportive. Wednesday. Badger trio attempts synchronized bowing. One is off beat. ***, Thursday. Entire scene rearranged into picnic. Fox asleep under tree. Badgers passing bread. ***, It was clear the tapestry had a mind of its own, or perhaps several minds stitched together across time. Willoughby began checking the other tapestries. He discovered a dozen more that behaved similarly. A knight and a dragon, who once fought heroically on a hilltop, now played chess beneath a tree. A great sea serpent that once loomed over a ship now lounged on an inflatable swan beside a sleepy sailor. A princess once trapped in a tower now sat on a bench outside the castle gates, handing out tiny paper fans and telling jokes to passing mice. He asked the castle historian, a woman named Mrs. Fig, who only came out of the archives when the teacups hummed in E-flat, if she knew anything about this. She adjusted her spectacles and said quite seriously, "The threads decide when they've told enough of the old story. Sometimes they get tired of drama." Willoughby nodded slowly. That sounded exactly right. So he began visiting the tapestries regularly, speaking softly to them, complimenting their choices, and bringing small offerings, dust-free brushes, bundles of lavender, a tiny feathered comb for the one with the unicorns. In return, the tapestries responded in their own gentle way. Once, when Willoughby was particularly tired, he passed the tapestry near the kitchen stairwell, an old piece that once showed a battle between two marmalade merchants. That night, the battle had been replaced by the two merchants sitting on crates, laughing together, each with a slice of bread and jam. Another night, he found a note tucked under the hem of a tapestry, depicting a sleepy wizard. The note read, "Greater than we've decided the wizard's hat is too pointy. He will now wear a knitted bonnet. Thank you for understanding." And indeed, the next morning, the wizard's pointy hat had vanished, replaced by a soft blue bonnet with tiny moons stitched into the wool. He looked far more relaxed. Willoughby smiled often now as he made his rounds, because Elderdown wasn't just a castle with sleepy things. It was alive in the way that only quiet places are slowly shifting to meet the moods of those who dwell within, softening their days, soothing their nights. And the tapestries, it seemed, had grown tired of heroic tailies and dramatic turns. They had decided, gently and without fuss, to become something else, memories of what could have been, stitched not for glory, but for comfort. He passed by the fox and badger tapestry later that week and paused again. They were all napping now. The fox, curled in a patch of embroidered sun. The badgers, stacked like furry pillows beneath a cherry tree. A lute lay untouched beside them. Willoughby touched the edge of the fabric. "Good choice," he whispered. A tiny thread wiggled in response, so faintly that he wasn't sure it had moved at all. From then on, the tapestries changed often. Never too quickly. Never in ways that startled. Just small shifts, like the dreams of a house that had learned to listen. And whenever a guest stopped and stared and asked, "Wasn't that tapestry different yesterday?" Willoughby would nod slowly and say, "Yes, but only a little. It's just telling a better story now." Because in Elderdown Keep, stories didn't have to end with battles and quests and triumphs. Sometimes the best stories ended with a picnic, or a nap, or a new hat, and all you had to do was listen to the threads. Elderdown Keep had many windows, some large and regal, letting in long beams of light that danced on ancient floors. Others tiny and tucked away, shaped like half-forgotten buttons. There were circular windows in stairwells, tall thin ones in the tower library, and one particularly peculiar window hidden behind a coat rack that smelled faintly of soup. But of all the castle's windows, only one was known to be alive. Not in the way people are alive, of course. It didn't speak. It didn't blink or sigh or complain about drafts. It simply watched, and it only watched one thing: the moon. It wasn't a grand window, just a modest square pane tucked near the north corner of the castle's third rooftop terrace, behind a small wooden door labeled **** broom storage, probably. ***, hardly anyone ever opened it. The staircase leading to it was narrow, the kind of place where dust preferred to gather in quiet contemplation. Master Willoughby found it one evening after misplacing a teacup during his nightly rounds. The cup, painted with sleepy hedgehogs, had wandered off after a particularly cozy infusion of lemon balm. Teacups sometimes did that in Elderdown. It was part of their personality. He followed a faint trail of honey drops up the tower stairs and, quite unexpectedly, opened the small broom storage door. There, in a short corridor that smelled of mothballs and forgotten socks, he found the window. It looked outward, not toward the gardens or the fields, but directly at the sky, and more specifically at the moon. A full moon hung there that night, round and soft and slightly golden at the edges. The window, without movement or sound, shimmered faintly. Its glass gave off the gentlest hum. Willoughby stood beside it for a long while, teacup now cradled gently in his hand. There was something restful about the space, as if the moonlight, after its long journey across the sky, had chosen this little window to pause and stretch. He returned the next night, and the next, the moon changed, as it always did, from full to waning, from crescent to new, from shy sliver to proud glow. And each night, the window responded, not dramatically. Sometimes its pane would glow the tiniest bit warmer, a blush of silver dancing along the sill. Other nights, the reflection in the glass showed a different kind of sky, a younger moon perhaps, or a cloudless night from long ago. Willoughby began bringing a cushion and a small notebook. He called it his lunologue. Entry 1. Moon very round tonight. Window seems pleased. Entry 4. Crescent shape. Window flickered like a candle when I hummed. Entry 7. Faint music. Thought I heard a lullaby when the moon peeked from behind a cloud. Entry 12. Window side. I'm almost sure of it. Like a long, contented exhale. He discovered that if he read poems aloud near the window, the moonlight seemed to glow brighter. If he sat in silence, the window shimmered as if nodding in quiet agreement. And if he fell asleep with his head against the frame, he often dreamt of floating gently and endlessly above the clouds where the moon was close enough to touch and always humming. One night, during a rare blue moon, he noticed something new. A message. It was faint, just a few words written in the condensation on the inside of the glass. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the words remained. Thank you for watching with me. He touched the message gently. It faded with the warmth of his fingers, like breath meeting breath. From that night on, Willoughby treated the window as an old friend. He cleaned its frame with lavender oil, added a lace curtain, and placed a tiny music box on the windowsill. It played a soft tune something between a lullaby and a memory. Sometimes others would join him. The baker, with warm rolls in hand. A visiting scholar, who brought an astronomy chart but forgot to use it. A castle cat named Whimsy, who curled up and purred at the moon as though it were a long-lost sibling. And each person, in their own quiet way, left something behind. A word, a sigh, a song, and the window listened. It became, in time, more than just a window. It was a place of pause, a place where time felt slightly less sharp, where hearts softened, and where even the moon, so often distant and cold, felt just a little closer. Some nights the moon would hide, and the window would fog. Not in sadness, exactly. More like ... waiting. Willoughby would still visit. He would read from his lunologue, sip his tea, and sit quietly. And when the moon returned, as it always did, the window would clear, glowing gently once more. It never asked for anything. It only ever watched. And perhaps that was its greatest kindness. Because in a world full of noise and questions and busy, bustling steps, the quiet act of watching gently, patiently, was its own kind of magic. So Willoughby continued to visit, and the window continued to shine. And together, in their own silent rhythm, they kept company with the moon. Of all the staircases in Elderdown Keep, and there were many, winding and wide, creaky and curling one, in particular, had earned a reputation for being unusually considerate. It didn't creak. It didn't wobble. It didn't rush. It simply took its time. Master Willoughby first noticed the staircase on a slow autumn morning, when the leaves in the courtyard drifted like daydreams, and the castle smelled faintly of cinnamon and just-baked bread. He had meant to go from the 3rd floor to the 4th. A simple task. Just fetch a fresh bundle of pillow fluff from the attic cupboard before lunch. But somewhere between step 11 and step 12, something changed. He was no longer in a hurry. He didn't feel the usual tug of time, the mental list of things to check, and beds to plump, and temperatures to adjust. Instead, a sense of calm wrapped around him, not unlike a feather quilt draped over the shoulders. He stopped walking and sat on the 12th step. It was warm. Not artificially so, just a natural, cozy warmth, like a stone heated by the sun. He looked around. The walls of the staircase were stone, but worn smooth over time, as if many hands had touched them with kindness. Faint carvings peeked out between the shadows. Flowers, stars, spirals, and tiny sleepy animals curled up in peaceful loops. He'd never noticed them before. The staircase didn't spiral dramatically or lead to any secret treasure room. It was just there, quiet and sturdy, and, as it turned out, entirely uninterested in rushing. Willoughby eventually stood and continued upward, but the steps seemed to pause between each rise. Not in a mechanical way. There were no clanks or clicks or magical tricks, just a gentle stretching of time. as if the staircase wanted him to notice something. And he did. On the next landing, a patch of sunlight fell across the floor in the shape of a goose. He chuckled softly. On the next, a faint scent of vanilla drifted from a tapestry. And on the final step before the attic, he heard music. Faint, soft, as though a harp were being played in a room made entirely of wool. When he reached the attic, he was calm, rested, and had entirely forgotten what he had come to fetch. He didn't mind. From that day forward, Willoughby used the staircase whenever he needed to think or not think. When days were long or weather was odd, or someone had spilled 6 jars of jam in the pantry again, he would take a moment and climb those quiet steps. The castle staff began to call it the slow stair. At first as a joke, then as a truth. People stopped using it to get somewhere fast. Instead, they used it to feel better. Children went there when they were anxious. Older folk when their joints needed patience. Visitors when they'd had too much tea and needed somewhere quiet to walk it off. And always the staircase obliged. It never changed shape, never tried to impress. It just remained exactly what it was. Patient. Willoughby started keeping a journal near the base of the staircase, tucked into a cubby with a pencil and a velvet bookmark. The cover read, "Thoughts from the steps." People began writing in it. Short phrases, half-formed dreams, observations that might otherwise have vanished. Asterisk, asterisk, felt lighter halfway up. Asterisk, 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 saw a moth land on the banister. It looked like it was thinking. Asterisk, 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 cried on step 16. Felt better by step 20. Asterisk, 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 forgot why I came. Remembered who I am. Asterisk, asterisk, the staircase, it seemed, had a gift. Not for height or elegance. But for stillness. It was the only part of the castle that seemed entirely content to go nowhere at all. And that made it rare. One day, a visitor arrived, a woman who hadn't slept properly in months. She was quiet, with eyes like weathered glass and a voice that barely stirred the air. Willoughby suggested the slow stair. She walked it once, just once, and when she reached the top, she sat on the landing and closed her eyes. Not to sleep exactly, but to rest, to breathe, to be. Later, she wrote in the journal, "Greater than the staircase didn't take me anywhere I needed to go. It just helped me stay with myself long enough to remember what that felt like." And Willoughby, reading that entry by candlelight one quiet night, closed the book and smiled. He thought then of how many places in the world rushed, how many halls echoed with footsteps, how many days were measured by speed and urgency and ticking. Clocks, but not here. Not this staircase. It had no clock, no competition, no hurry. It was, in its own humble way, a reminder that time can stretch and soften if we let it. That sometimes what we need isn't to get somewhere faster, but to walk a little slower. To notice the stone, the sunbeam, the scent of something sweet. To let the staircase be not a path to the next thing, but a place all on its own. So Willoughby kept walking it. Step by step, and the staircase, in return, kept offering its gentle gift, a pause, a breath, a moment, because sometimes, even in a castle full of magical tea and humming quilts and moon-watching, windows, the most powerful enchantment of all, was simply the kindness of taking your time. In a quiet corner of Elderdown Keep, where 2 corridors met in an accidental hug, there was a closet. It had no sign, no number, and no particular reason for anyone to open it, at least not at first glance. Its handle was slightly crooked. Its hinges creaked in a voice that sounded more sleepy than rusty. and its door was painted the color of oatmeal, left too long in the sun. Most people walked right past it, but not Master Willoughby. One rainy afternoon, after a rather intense hour spent calming the teacups, who had recently started forming a union and requesting spa days, he found himself meandering the castle halls with no particular destination in mind. He turned the corner near the coat rack that held only scarves, yawned softly, and stopped in front of the door. He didn't remember. He had walked this hallway hundreds of times. Surely he would have noticed a door with a handle, shaped like a sleeping snail. He reached out and opened it. The light inside was dim but cozy. The scent was a blend of lavender sachets, pencil shavings, and dust that had decided not to be bothersome. Shelves lined the walls, but not in any order that made sense. There were hats inside teapots, boots stuffed with scarves, books tucked inside pillowcases, and a single drawer that appeared to hum when left open too long. Willoughby blinked. He took a step inside, and the door gently closed behind him. It was a small space. Not cramped, just snug. The kind of room that made you want to sit on the floor and forget about clocks. A place where things didn't match, that somehow belonged together anyway. He wandered slowly, taking in the objects. There was a box labeled, "Buttons Without Buddies." Inside were buttons of every shape and color, some shiny, some matte, some shaped like birds, stars, or question marks. None of them matched, but all of them seemed content to be together. There was a mirror with one side cracked just slightly. When he looked into it, he didn't see himself as he was, but as he might be if he had just woken from a long, wonderful nap in a field of sleepy daisies. He liked that version. There was a pair of gloves, one made of velvet, the other of knitted wool. They were tied together with a ribbon and labeled not quite a pair, but still holding hands. There were stacks of socks, none matching, all folded gently. A cupboard full of teacups with slightly chipped rims and delicate cracks, sitting proudly as if to say, asterisk, we've been used well. Asterisk, and in the corner, a small wooden sign, greater than the closet of perfectly mismatched things, where lost finds rest. Willoughby exhaled, not a sigh of sadness, nor relief, just a quiet sound of rightness. He sat on a cushion that was slightly lumpy and wonderfully soft, its fabric covered in elephants wearing crowns. One of the elephants winked at him. Or perhaps it was a wrinkle in the stitching. The room seemed to breathe with him. Not literally, but in the way a quiet space can make your thoughts less sharp and more like clouds drifting across your mind. He stayed for a long time. Eventually, he found a notebook tucked between two floppy hats. It was filled with handwritten notes, some from Castlestaff, some in tiny, careful childlike script, some in smudged pencil, all unsigned. Asterisk, asterisk, I wore this shoe the day I met my best friend. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. This scarf was left behind on purpose. It missed this place. Asterisk, 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 my favorite button. It popped off during a laugh. I didn't want to sew it back on. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The teacup cracked during a thunderstorm. It still holds warmth. Asterisk, asterisk, Willoughby smiled. The closet was not a place for broken things. It was a place for stories that didn't quite fit anymore. For items with history in their stitches, in their scratches, in their mismatched parts. And in that moment, he understood. Something he'd never put into words before. Comfort doesn't always come from perfection. Sometimes. Comfort comes from feeling like you belong, even when you don't match. Even when your pieces aren't tidy. Even when you're just a single glove waiting for someone to notice, you're still warm inside. He stood, stretched slowly, and added a small item to the shelf of velvet bookmark, frayed at the edges. It had been his since he was a boy, lost. Once in a field, found again in a castle window. The thread had faded, but it still held stories in every loop. He left it with no label, just a whisper, for someone who reads slowly. From that day on, Willoughby visited the closet often, not always to leave something, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to match socks that didn't want matching, sometimes to breathe in a space that accepted everything gently, just as it was. He told no one at first, but the castle had a way of sharing things quietly. Soon others found it too. Young gardener who brought her broken trowel and left it beside a watering can with a bent spout, an old cook who left a spoon worn smooth from decades of stirring. Soups no one remembered by name. A child who placed a stuffed bear missing both. Ears on the shelf beside a headless doll and whispered, "You can talk to each other now." And the closet welcomed them all. Never loudly, just a quiet hinge creak, a breath of soft lavender, and room enough for one more mismatched thing. Elderdown Keep didn't care for perfection, that it cared for kindness, for comfort, for things that had lived and been used and loved and dropped and stitched and still mattered. And the closet of perfectly mismatched things, nestled behind that sleepy hallway corner, reminded everyone who stepped inside that being a little crooked, a little chipped, a little worn might just be the most comforting thing of all. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday, at Elderdown Keep. The days didn't rush to be counted. They moved like soft waves on a still pond, rippling gently from one to the next without fuss. But on that particular, not quite specific day, something changed quietly, naturally, as all things in the castle did. It started with a yawn, a deep, luxurious, full-body yawn that began somewhere in the knees and climbed all the way up to the eyebrows. Master Willoughby, bundled in his robe stitched, with sleepy owls, had just finished his morning tea. Forecast: gentle breeze, low chance of philosophical thoughts. When the yawn arrived, it wasn't just any yawn, It was the kind of yawn that comes from somewhere older than the bones. A yawn that felt less like tiredness and more like permission. Permission to pause. Permission to rest. He blinked slowly, let the last sip of tea settle warmly in his chest, and looked out the window beside him. The clouds outside were thick and soft, the color of oversteeped chamomile. Somewhere far off, a bird chirped once, and then seemed to fall asleep mid-tweet. Castle was quiet, not silent, just deeply still. Even the usual murmuring of the hallway rugs had gone hushed, as if they too were tucking in for a moment of stillness. Willoughby stood, padded slowly down the corridor, and past the slipper library. The slippers were stacked neatly, some snoring softly. He passed the Mosquito lounge, where tiny hammocks swayed and the soothskeeters were mid-dream. He passed the staircase that took its time, and it seemed even slower today, as if encouraging him not to climb. He smiled, shuffled toward the central wing, and paused in front of a door that had never been labeled, never been locked, never been noticed. It was just a door. But today, it felt like the right one. He opened it. Inside was a room lit with the kind of golden light that feels like late afternoon, no matter the hour. A single feather bed sat at the center. It was not grand, not canopied or embroidered or stacked with pillows. It was simple, soft, and impossibly inviting. There were no clocks, no to-do lists, no voices. Just a hush that wrapped itself gently around the bones and said, Asterisk, now is the time. Asterisk Willoughby walked to the bed. He lay down and slept, not a nap of necessity, not a sleep of exhaustion, but a true rest, the kind that slips past dreams and into memory, the kind that doesn't measure itself in hours, but in how deeply you exhale. He slept, and the castle slept too, slowly, gently. One room after another softened into slumber, the teacups stopped humming. Mid-tune. The windows blinked closed their moonlit reflections. The fireplaces sighed, their flames curling into embered dreams. The pillows fluffed themselves into the exact shape needed and waited patiently. The tapestries paused their ever-shifting scenes. Frozen mid-lullaby. In the grand hall of almost forgotten, sounds went still, its jars and shells resting quietly on their shelves. Even the castle bell tower let out a long, slow chime, as if struck by a sleeping breeze rather than a rope. And all of Elderdown Keep drifted into a nap, not for days, not for weeks, for 100 years, but only in the way that time forgets itself when sleep is deep enough, kind enough. To the rest of the world, Elderdown faded into a tale, a story told between sips of tea or read at bedtime to children too curious to sleep. Asterisk, a castle that slept. Asterisk, with a man who had watched the moon, listened to the slippers, spoken with pillows, and brewed weathering cups. Asterisk, but inside that quiet dream of stone and quilt, Master Willoughby slept gently, a small smile curling at the corners of his mouth. One day, perhaps a century later, or just a moment, the window stirred and the breeze nudged a curtain awake. He would open his eyes, stretch softly, and feel that warm glow still waiting in his chest. He would sit up, place his feet into waiting slippers, and whisper, "That was a lovely nap." And the castle, all around him, would agree, because Elderdown Keep was not built for noise, or haste, or the restless ticking of clocks. It was built for comfort, for calm, for the quiet, cozy oddities that make sleep not a pause in the day, but a home. And in that home, dreams were soft, time was patient, and rest was sacred. So if ever you find yourself restless, wondering where the softness of the world has gone, close your eyes, breathe slow, and imagine the winding halls of a castle that sleeps on purpose, where even the dust naps with dignity, where every mismatched thing is welcome. And where, somewhere in a room that never needed a name, a man in lavender robes lies still and dreams in peace.